There, now we're good. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to NorthStar community. So great to be here. Appreciate everybody that's here helping make this happen, and so excited for everybody to be joining us today, and look forward to a great week of recovery for all of us. So again, I always make the assumption that if you're listening to me, you're at some form of recovery. May have just been in the beginning stages of it, or you may be down the road a ways. But it's always important for us to stay connected to community and to be connected, because as we know, in addiction, one of the things we love to do is disconnect and get away from the healthy people in our lives. So I haven't talked about this in a while, so I thought I would do this today. Oh, happy day. I'm going to talk about the ACE and what it means for us in recovery. And so one of the things that I quote Russell Brand here, who I really do like his recovery take. He's recovered drug and alcoholic, and you probably know him. He's a comedian. Starting to be kind of seen as a kind of a leading podcast guy now. I think I saw he has over 7 million subscribers now. Anyway, but his quote is that addiction starts with pain and addiction ends with pain. And that really is the paradigm of recovery, is that once we understand why did drugs and alcohol or people or compulsive behaviors, why did they become so important to us, particularly for many of us when we were young? Why was that so important for us? You know people who drank some when they were in high school and moved on and fine. But you know the people like yourself who drank in high school and it became wildly important to you and you couldn't stop. Why does that happen? Some of it, of course, I think is purely the grace of God, but for most of us it's pain. For most of us it's trauma. Most of us it's abandonment. It's just our lives were so shattered as kids, and like I always say, the problem with so what we don't understand about the trauma and abandonment, particularly in the family systems, is that not only do we make huge mistakes, our parents made mistakes. Again, I'm not judging anybody's parents. I'm not judging you as a parent. I'm a parent, and Lord knows I could have done a lot of things different. The point is, though, I always believe we did the best we could. Some of us were very broken, though. And so the problem is, when we're broken, we do broken things. And for many of us, we had broken parents, and there's no other way to say it. And we were abandoned, we were traumatized. When you look around the room at our NorthStar community service or our support groups, vast majority have lots of trauma in their lives. So if you're listening to this and you've had a lot of trauma in your life, I hope you're doing something to deal with it. If you're telling me you don't have trauma in your life, good for you. We don't want to forget about abandonment issues as well. But we don't just become addicted. We don't just become destructive without some reasons for it. I mean, something drives this. And so what I think is so important for us is to become aware of what drives us. The awareness then starts to make sense to us, and then we can do something about it. I've seen so many people almost relieved when they start to put 2 and 2 together and realize that they had some tough childhoods or whenever, sometime in their lives, it just made it so hard to move on and to get healthy. And so today we're going to talk about the ACE score, just so you can help you understand a little bit of maybe where you're coming from. So I'm going to read 2 Corinthians 11. Kind of debated what to talk about here, but Paul again wrote half of the books in the New Testament. If you aren't aware of who he is, certainly seen as one of the major players in Christianity. He's an icon to us in many ways. But even after he became a Christian, there was a lot of conflict in the Christian community. There was a lot of painful moments there. But I think we'd be fair to say that Paul had a pretty tough life, particularly after he became a Christian, which I always think is important to talk about, because when we're in affluent societies, we tend to not like pain. We like to get rid of pain as fast as we can. Which, who doesn't? I certainly don't like pain. None of us here like pain. You don't like pain. But the problem is we take away some of the benefits of pain when we so quickly get rid of it. Always reminded of Philip Yancey's writing about, he's a Christian writer, very, very good writer. If you haven't read him, he's good. He talked about traveling the world, and he said in poor countries, people pray to God to help them get through the pain. And he said what he notices in rich countries, we ask for God to get rid of the pain. And that's a big difference. So getting through the pain is way different than getting rid of the pain. Again, I don't like pain, that's the point. But sometimes pain is what takes us to the next level and gets us to where we want to be. So Paul's talking about his life, and this is after he became a Christian, so make sure you hear that. So I've worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. So right there is trauma. When you're exposed to death, you're going to have trauma. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. I don't know about you, but that sounds awful. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. So other than that, he hasn't had any problems. I have labored and toiled and I have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily pressure of my concern for all of the churches. Who is weak and I do not feel weak. Who is led into sin, I do not enter. I can read here today. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. Then I would say that he certainly faced abandonment as well once he became a Christian. There was a lot of infighting there for a while. Who is weak and I do not feel weak? Who is led into sin and I do not inwardly burn? If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. So anyway, Paul gets it. I don't know about his childhood, but he certainly faced trauma as a young adult. And trauma changes who we are. It's important for us to figure that out. So the problem is, we've had a lot of trauma and abandonment. We live in the past processing and protecting the abandonment and trauma issues instead of looking towards the future with optimism and hope. One of the problems that happens is when we have extensive trauma and abandonment in our lives, we have this thing called neurogating, where the logical side of our brain and the emotional side of our brain, when we're doing well, work together. That's what you want. You want to be appropriately emotional. You want to be appropriately logical all at the same time. When we have a lot of trauma and abandonment, we have a lot of toxic shame that hits us. And so the gate shuts between, and so we become highly emotional or we become highly logical, which becomes destructive. So we can be very hard on ourselves. And so it's important for us to understand this and put some logic to it. Then we can move on and live our lives. And here's the other thing, you can't turn the clock back. You really have a choice to make. You can continue down the destructive path of abusing, manipulating, lying, resenting, you know all the terms that we do when we're in our addictive mode. We can continue to do that, or we can take all this trauma and abandonment and figure out a way to make us better. And I know that's so hard to do. But it's your choice. It really is your choice. You can sit around and protect your trauma and abandonment. You can hide it. You can then go out and do destructive things, or you can see the destruction, put logic to it, and become a healthier person. That's really your choice to make. That's why I love addiction recovery so much, is because it truly is one of the only times where a disease, we have a disease that we actually can become better from. Most diseases leave lots of damage after the fact, but really with addiction recovery, if you can recover, you're a better person than you were before it ever happened. So we got to remember that addiction is habitual behavior to avoid pain. How many times have we heard the saying, if you don't stop, you're going to lose your job, you're going to lose your family, you're going to whatever. And we just keep going. And the problem is with trauma and abandonment is we tend to diagnose the wrong things. You know, we talk about ADHD, we talk about oppositional defiant disorder, we talk about all these things we diagnose particularly kids with, when the fact is they're probably being traumatized. A great statistic, I think, that to emphasize how important it is to understand trauma is that 72% of obese women are sexually assaulted, have been sexually assaulted in their lives. So the point is, and it makes sense to do that because people who are obese will tell you that people really aren't mean to them, we just don't see them. And so it makes sense if you want to be safe. I know people at NorthStar who are recovering. I'm talking about women who are recovering, who are sexually assaulted, and they are starting to get their physical lives in order. They're starting to be, they've lost some weight, things like that, and they've told me how uncomfortable it is for them to get male attention again. I mean, you see how trauma and abandonment works. It is in the past, but it's in our present. We live our lives around that. I mean, how much sense does it make for us to know about trauma? It makes sense, but it doesn't make sense for us to be carrying childhood trauma, abandonment, which equals anxiety, depression, fear, all those things. For us to be carrying stuff that happened to us 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, whatever year ago it was, from a very logical point of view, doesn't make sense. But from a survival point of view, it makes absolute sense. Because one of the problems with, we have to understand family systems a bit. Family dynamics, family systems are rigid, difficult, and usually destructive. Not always, but usually. And what makes family systems so difficult is it's so hard to change. It's so rigid. So the problem is when we, particularly coming from dysfunctional families, there's a lot of harm, there's a lot of hurt, but you know what maybe makes it the worst is the silence. Nobody talks about it. I always kind of kiddingly talk about this with people who have been in traumatic and dysfunctional families. I always say about, you know, dad comes home drunk, beats the crap out of everybody, throws things, breaks things, or mom doesn't come home for 5 days, or whatever it is that happens. And I say, but then the family all sits down and discusses it. They all talk about how it affected them emotionally, talked about how, you know, what needed to be different. And no, that's not what happens. Dysfunctional families, nobody talks about anything. All we have left to do is judge ourselves, and particularly as kids, that's what we do. We judge ourselves and we see ourselves as the problem, when the fact is we're probably the victims. Certainly later on we may be the perpetrators. But think about all the crazy stuff we do defending our trauma and our abandonment backgrounds. And the other problem is, as a society, we are getting better, and I hope we don't swing too far the other way. We have tendencies to do that. But we are starting to recognize trauma more now, and we're starting to see it as something that's legitimate and it's clinical, and there's reasons to do something about it. And that's why the Bible, I just love so much, because the Bible talks about all the things we do wrong as people and the trauma and the terribleness and all the things, but it always gets back to the same thing about is God's grace and love. So, purpose of addiction, again, is to avoid pain. So whether we're achieving comfort, joy, or relief from our hurts, habits, and hang-ups, it's destructive in the long run. When we live addictively, we live without purpose. We've been talking about that a lot in NorthStar recently. It's hard for us to think about purpose when we're living in survival mode. And then the other thing is we disconnect, and so silence creates so much confusion, so much pain, so much denial, self-loathing, toxic. I can go on about this, but most of what we're doing is we're protecting ourselves from the past. And we have these overwhelming feelings that we are weak, we are dependent, we are undeserving. We see ourselves as mediocre at best. We continue to beat the crap out of ourselves internally. We never see ourselves as enough. It's kind of easy to understand why addiction becomes prominent in our lives when this is what we're feeling. And without guidance, we will never know what it means to recover from trauma and abandonment. So I guess today what I'm trying to do is give you the permission to understand the trauma in your life and to become aware of it and understand that it's tough and it's hard to come through this. Because true recovery really means confronting and understanding uncomfortable feelings and then how to deal with them. And the problem is, for many of us, some of these feelings are so intense, it is just so much easier to not think about them. But the problem is, if you don't talk about them, those intense feelings got to go somewhere. And so what we tend to do is we tend to humiliate and shame ourselves. I believe without question that shame, if you have shame, you will not recover. If you have recovered and you're carrying shame, you will relapse. We have to figure out ways to get past it. Think about all of you out there that are living with so much anxiety, with maybe OCD, depression, all those things. I always think it's important, and I see this a lot in recovery. There's certainly clinical, physiological reasons for depression, things like that, but the one that we can do something about is look at the depression that's caused by anger turned inward. All that anger we have at people around us that betrayed us, the people that have harmed us, and we don't ever connect enough to think could possibly not be all our fault. We always talk about the 51% rule. We all are 51% responsible for our behaviors, but so were our parents, so were other people in our lives. And so it's so important for us to be a bit forgiving of ourselves and understand that we don't have to shame ourselves for all of our adverse childhood experiences. And I would go as far as say that really the adverse childhood experience is one of our major public health crises that we don't want to look at. So we're going to look at the ACE today. It was written, it's 10 questions. I think the original reason for it was to use it in legal court settings, but it certainly is one that I think is great. We use it all the time in NorthStar just to help people really understand where they're coming from, or help me understand where they're coming from. So basically the way to look at it is the higher your score, the higher the suffering. So if you have a ACE score of 4 or higher, you have a 15% greater chance of heart, COPD, and immunological diseases. And this is the score of scores. If you score 6 or more without intervention, you will die on average 20 years younger than an individual with a score of 0. So that's important. If you don't buy that trauma and abandonment are important, just hear those statistics. And the problem is, I think about, like, one of my cousins was deeply abandoned, traumatized. He died when he was in his mid-50s from alcoholism. He was so broken, so abandoned, so mistreated. Came from a situation where he was removed from his support system in the Midwest and was moved to California. Lived in a wealthy home, but with a stepfather who hated him, basically. He did all sorts of things to create problems for everybody around him in his pain and his misery. And he did end up, he lived recklessly. He lived addictively. Should have died way before that. And that's what happens when we're when we have unresolved trauma and abandonment issues, we don't understand it. And so in many ways, we're killing ourselves slowly or quickly with all that. Someone read the questions to you. While you were growing up during your first 18 years of life, did a parent or other adult in the household often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid you might be physically hurt? Did a parent or other adult in the household often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? Did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you, or have you touched their body in a sexual way, or tried to or actually have oral, anal, or vaginal sex with you? And I would say that 28% of females answered that as yes, 16% males. So it's probably actually higher than that. Did you often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? Question 5, did you often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, and had no one to protect you, or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you or take you to the doctor if you needed it? 6, were your parents ever separated or divorced? 7, was your mother or stepmother often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her, or sometimes or often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard? Or ever repeatedly hit over at least a few minutes or threatened with a gun or knife? Did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic or who used street drugs? Was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? Did a household member go to prison? So those are the questions. So ACE scores of 4 or more, women had a 66% higher level of depression than those that scored 0, and 35% more for men. People were 7 times more likely than adults with a 0 score to become an alcoholic. If you had a score of 6 or more, you had a 4,600% more likely to use IV drugs than a 0 score. Women who had high ACE scores had a higher rate of rape as adults. So the 0 scores was about 5%, 4 or more was 33% for domestic violence. So as you can see, and there's a lot of reliability on this, there's lots and lots of data on this. And you can find it anywhere, just go out on the internet, you can pull it up easily. I want to try and get you to see here is understand that if you're struggling with recovery, you probably have abandonment and trauma in your life. Now, we haven't really talked about abandonment quite as much. Abandonment's a little trickier because you don't always see it, and it doesn't always look awful. But when you're a child and you're left to yourself to figure out who you are, to figure out what makes you special, your life is to help. I always talk about the script being flipped. So many children who were abandoned as children, the way it was done was they were put in charge of their parents' happiness. It was their job to make their parents feel good about themselves instead of the other way around. So healthy parents, we want our kids to be healthy, happy, and whole. And we will sacrifice at great lengths to do that. Children who are abandoned would hear more things like, if I never had you, my life would be better. You've robbed me of my career. I can think of all these things I've heard. Or they just never talk about anything. They never were there, or if they were there, they didn't talk much. Certainly didn't talk about those kind of things. So when we're children, the only thing we can do is we have to absolutely trust in our parents, which also means that we have to absolutely believe that we are the problem for any things that go wrong. When mommy's not happy, if we're in a dysfunctional family, the only assumption we can make is we're the reason for that. And that's why when you get to be 14, 15, 16, and you suddenly find a group who are acting out and drinking and using drugs, they become wildly important to you because you feel important there. But we just have to understand shame and drives up so much, and abandonment drives up shame. So all this sounds so fun, doesn't it? But here's the thing, we can recover from this, but we have to become aware of it. That's the biggest thing. That's why I love the ACE. It's hard to argue the ACE. I've had people take it and then come back later and do it again, and their score gets higher because then they're being honest about it because they felt like they had to protect other people. So I want you to make sure I'm not judging anybody. I do not. There's some pretty awful stories out there I know from adults who were kids who there's some of them are mind-bogglingly bad. It's hard not to be judgmental at some of those parents, but I just understand, I just understand the misery people have in their lives, and I just believe people do the best they can. Some are pretty destructive. I'm not going to sit here and say otherwise. It's hard sometimes to think that, but on a whole, I think most people were doing the best they could. They were just very broken because of their childhoods. It's just an ongoing thing. I always talk to people in NorthStar, think about, for the ones that have high ACE scores and stuff, I always go, think about the legacy you have a chance to do here. So, and I always tell them, what are some of the good qualities of your very destructive parents? A lot of them were hardworking. A lot of them were, the old joke about he was a great employee when he was sober. They did some things right. And I always say, try to imagine your parents recovered. What would they have looked like? Well, that's the gifts that they gave you, is your DNA. You getting recovered gives you a chance then to pass on that wonderful DNA you were given to your children, but not so broken. Think about having a rich, full, meaningful life that you're able to have because you can connect in love and you can see purpose in your life and you can see the damage and the trauma and abandonment, but you can move on from it and make you a better person. That's what we have to do. So your legacy is to take that wonderful DNA your parents gave you and try to just for a moment imagine what they would have looked like if they'd done what you're doing and get it recovery. So we have to become aware of the pain and the behaviors caused by the abandonment and trauma. Don't minimize it. Don't try to cover it up. Don't try to, try to minimize it. I see that all the time. Well, I've had people tell me who were sexually abused their childhood, well, I didn't have as bad as some others did. And I always go, well, maybe, but you certainly had it pretty bad. We have a joke with one of the people I talk to about, well, doesn't every dad pull a gun on their kid? I go, as the first time he told me, I said, that's not normal, right? Most parents don't pull guns on their kids. And he's like, really? I said, yeah, really. That's how broken some of these families are. So don't minimize. But you got to find healthy people. That's what support groups are all about. AA, all those places, they're so good for this. I think NorthStar is really good for this because we really focus on this. I see addictive behavior as the result of trauma and abandonment for most people. I have yet to have anybody who's a substance abuser ever tell me they didn't have trauma. Dr. Vanderkolk, who I love as a psychiatrist, he really is helping with trauma and abandonment in our society. He wrote the book, The Body Keeps a Score. I was listening to a talk of his the other day, and he said, it's virtually impossible for an adult to become addicted to substances without trauma. That's important to hear. What he's basically saying is if you do not have I think everybody's got some trauma and abandonment in their lives, but if you don't have significant trauma and abandonment, it's unlikely you're going to become an addict. That's pretty big if you think about it. So you have to get people in your lives. You have to go from acting out to reaching out. You have to figure out ways to connect with the right people, not your tribe, not the people who want you to be dysfunctional. And I hate to say it, but some of you live in families that don't want you to get well. You have to find the groups that want you to get well. You have to live with intentional gratitude. And I hope, above all, I know it's hard to understand this, but God loves you. God doesn't want you to live a life of torment. If you'll just look, he'll put people in your life to help you with this, but you got to look. And you got to quit protecting the trauma and abandonment. It doesn't do you any good. So, I wish I could go on about this. I don't want to make you fall asleep on me here, but to God, you're important. God does not keep score. God knows your heart. God knows your true DNA. He created it. You can recover, but it does take pain. Our addictions start with pain, and our addictions end with pain. As simple as I can say it. And families, let your addicts suffer and feel the pain they need to get better. Get out of their way. Every time you intervene, all you're doing is prolonging the inevitable. Allow people to feel their pain so they can recover. I really wish there was another way. If there is, someone will be a billionaire when they figure it out. So, I'm going to finish this with Matthew 10. What's the price of a pet canary? Some loose change, right? And God cares what happens to it even more than you do. He pays even greater attention to you, down to the last detail, even numbering the hairs on your head. So don't be intimidated. You're worth more than 1,000,000 canaries. So we always kid about that. You know you are worth more than 1,000,000 canaries. And I wish I could give you answers on why did all the bad stuff happen to you. I don't know why. We're broken people. But you're here listening to me, so you at some level are in recovery. So keep going. You can do it. It's hard, but you can do it. So to end this, we meet on Wednesdays and Fridays at 6:30 here in Walnut Grove Baptist Church here in Mechanicsville. We also meet Sunday mornings at 9 a.m. We have child care for all of those time frames. So if you got little kids, we had 8 kids here Friday night. They were running up and down the place and eating all the food and playing on the piano, and I love every second of it. We've got some really good teen girls that watch them, and they do a great job. And bring your kids, bring yourself. I know a couple of those parents have admitted to me the only reason they come is because their kids make them come, so that's good. But we feed you on Wednesdays and Fridays. You don't have to eat before you come. That takes away one of your excuses. So I've taken away 2 of your excuses now. One is childcare and the other is eating. You don't need to go home and eat. You don't need to stop and eat, because when you go home, you're going to sit down and you're going to go, I'll go next week. So we start at 6:30 both times. Come to the front of the church, park in the parking lot up by the chapel. So obviously, we have the online service if you're sitting here listening to me. If you ever want to get a hold of me, you can email me at csimpson@wgva.church. We're having a little trouble with our phones right now, so it's better to email me. So anyway, if you're not local, I'd love to hear from you. And so we always end our meetings with a prayer of serenity, so let's go ahead and do that. And again, I'm just so grateful you were here today, and face your pain. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardships as a pathway to peace. Taking, as Jesus did, the sinful world as it is, not as I would have it. Trusting that Jesus will make all things right if I surrender to his will, that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with him forever in the next. Amen. Again, thanks for joining me, and have a great week.